Good morning. My name is Megan Leverage. I'm a Senior Workplace Program Associate at Tanenbaum, and I'm also trained as an American religious historian, so it is my great pleasure to be introducing and moderating this panel on the history of religion at work. So first, I want to introduce our panelists. To my left, first we have Zahra Jamal, CEO and founder of the Inclusion Expert. On the screen here, zooming in from Germany, we have Joerg Schmitz. Joerg is Managing Director of the Inclusive Leadership Institute. Next, we have Robbie Jones, President and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute, or PRRI, and Isaac Weiner, Associate Professor and Director of the Ohio State University's Center for the Study of Religion. Before I turn it over to our wonderful panelists, I just want to very briefly frame the conversation. At Tanenbaum, we defined religion at work in terms of the workforce, the workplace, and the marketplace. Here you can see our model with some examples. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list. Indeed, at Tanenbaum, religion at work is a very broad category. And this brings me to an important point, which is we only have 45 minutes today, so there's no way for us to offer any kind of survey. It won't be comprehensive and we won't cover everything. Instead, we've asked our panelists who are leading experts to speak from their particular areas of expertise. At the same time, all of you have the opportunity to help shape today's conversation. For this panel, The History of Religion at Work, we're going to put this model into a broad historical context. On the theme of our summit, we're going to examine pieces of religion at work, past, present, and future. And so I want to begin with you, the audience, both in person and online. And I want to focus on a time period that is most familiar to us all, which is the present. So looking at our model here, to help you get started, I want to ask you, what are you currently seeing now in this present moment in terms of religion at work? And we have some mic runners, as well as a mic runner for our online panelists, or maybe not. So what do you think? What are you currently seeing in terms of religion at work? Any ideas? Oh.
Hi, all. I think there is, in our company, we see such a divergence, really, among the groups. You know, it's a time we think it's more important than ever to have that inclusivity, the openness, understanding, right? Having moments that are teachable moments for all, you know. So last week we had, or the week before, I'm not sure, we had a Ramadan and Eid celebration, right? That was not only just a celebration, but it was also a panel. And, you know, I learned things that I didn't know. So I think having those kind of moments for your employees to learn from each other and begin to appreciate everybody's unique experiences and backgrounds is so important. So.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Morning, everyone. I'm PC Carter of Liberty Mutual. I lead all of our ERGs. And what we're seeing is a need for employees to have two things. One, a safe space where they can really, truly bring their whole selves, including their religions, to work, especially considering in the work from home, hybrid environments where they're really dealing with what's going on in their immediate environment, which isn't an office anymore. It's their bedroom, it's their dining room, it's their whatever they're doing at home. And then we're also seeing a lot of people saying, what about us? You're not mentioning us. And so they're not getting that feeling of belonging. So that's the reason why I'm here, is to figure out how we can incorporate all that within our ERG structure.
Thank you.
Good morning, Andrea Wicks-Bowles. I'm with LCW. We're a very small organization, but we're mighty. So I'm going to speak from what I'm hearing from my clients. Two things. One, some of the employee impact survey comments are starting to bring up things like, I'm a Christian, so I'm not comfortable with this idea that we're supposed to embrace LGBT, whatever that is. So this context is coming up. Now, the good news is, if that's how you feel, it's coming up in the survey, so it's important to note. The other piece is the interest from some, a senior manager saying, why don't we have a Christian support or ERG? And the DEI practitioners coming to me as a consultant saying, how do I even approach formatting a way to figure out what we will do, how to even think about it, what we should be doing or not. So that's why I'm totally interested in everybody's perspective, because we're looking for skills and tips for helping a company figure out how to embrace religious impact potential. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, Brian Grimm with the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation, longtime fan of Mark. One thing, we produce a report every year that looks, that monitors the Fortune 500 and now the FTSE 100 on what's presented on their diversity pages regarding religion and other topics. And we have a report coming out on the 21st of this month, and I won't give away the punchline, but I can, in broad terms, we've seen a very significant increase in the number of Fortune 500 companies either mentioning, describing, or illustrating religion on their diversity pages. Huge jump from last year. So it may be the content, there's a lot of reasons that could be, but maybe we got better accounting, but not that much. So there's a real change. And also on employee resource groups, we've seen a marked increase in the number of Fortune 500 companies mentioning on their pages that they have faith-based employee resource groups. So both trends are up. So sort of if I could put it, religion is really the next big thing, and diversity is what I'm seeing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So without further ado, I want to turn to our panelists to add and build on some of the things that you all brought up. I'll start on my left here with Zahra. Maybe we can go down the line.
Sure, absolutely. So I think one of the important things that we see going on in the workplace is really the growth in calls from corporate America on needing presentations on Islamophobia in the workplace. And most of those calls are actually coming from the general employee base. Typically, you don't have the Muslim employees speaking up and asking for it. And in part, what the companies are saying is that we don't actually know what our Muslim employees are thinking and what they need, because we don't have those direct relationships with them. Some of them do, and they have Muslim ERGs or its equivalent, but many of them don't. And so I wanted to cover a little bit about what their experiences are like and perhaps why it is that they're not speaking out. Islamophobia is the fear of and discrimination against Islam and Muslims, and it is grounded in stereotypes that frame Muslims as violent and backwards, and sort of pin collective blame on Muslims for the actions of extremists and terrorists. But Islamophobia at work is not new. Muslims in America are 1% of the workforce, but consistently for the past 20 plus years, they have represented 20% of workplace religious discrimination claims. Think about that statistic for a moment. 1% of the workforce representing 20% of the workplace religious discrimination claims. And you might ask, well, aren't other religious groups being targeted? Well, indeed they are. But a recent national survey of 13,000 Americans shows us that Muslims report the most religious discrimination in business-related functions. And it's across the talent life cycle, from hiring and promotion to firing, to unfair work evaluations, even being refused services in a place of business. So you go on your coffee break to get a cup of coffee or a sandwich on your way to the airport, and you may not be served. You get to the airport and you're facing challenges in that space as well. And so you can see that there is outsized impact of religious discrimination for this particular community. And lastly, Islamophobia at work is not unique to the United States. It is indeed global. From China to Canada, we see it everywhere. We see it in re-education camps. We see it in daily discrimination in Germany. most recent stats in the UK is that 70% of Muslims face religious abuse at work. And in fact, some of these numbers are rising because since October 7th, we saw a 600% increase in hate crimes against Muslims in the UK and a 200% increase in this country. It's at the highest level in the past 30 years, and that's when the measurements began. French Muslims are having to seek employment abroad because there's so much discrimination where they are, and guess where they're going? They're going to the UK because it's still better over there than it is in France. Islamophobia is also something that we see in India. So you see the rise of alternative ethno-nationalisms as well, and religious nationalisms that play a role. And beyond that, for those of you who follow the current political moment, this month there are elections in India, and ahead of those elections, they just implemented their new citizenship law last month, which allows for Muslims to be detained, deported, or even stripped of their citizenship, but guarantees and fast-track citizenship opportunities for pretty much all other religious minorities. And then lastly, of course, the EEOC has been noting the rise in religious bias and discrimination in US workplaces, and they're keeping a close eye on it over the last number of months. So I think outsized impact and a lot of work and opportunity for us to work on the inclusion, belonging, and safety that all of you mentioned as the need of the day.
Thank you. Joerg, would you like to add or build on something?
Yeah, probably build on is the, oops, sorry, that was an echo, I guess. Build on is more my theme, I think. I'm just reminded in my work of a couple of conversations I've had recently with executives and CEOs of different companies. So I'll give you two first, for the reasons that Zahra, really led into. That was a CEO of a Turkish company, and also a number of executives in a Saudi Arabian organization. And they were both, and we were all talking about DEI actually, and DEI strategies for their respective organizations. And when I actually introduced the topic of religious diversity and how important it is, all of a sudden I saw them perk up. I saw them really resonating with that aspect of diversity, because all of a sudden they felt included and they could relate to the conversation. That's not insignificant when you think about the global nature of DEI work that DEI work has anyway, and in many organizations that you represent here, thinking of your global scope, all of a sudden we're opening a door that could be very inclusive, right? Because people feel that something about them that's central to them gets recognized as part of our agenda to discuss human diversity. And I think that's the interesting point that I'm observing, that even though religious, spiritual diversity is probably one of the oldest forms of human diversity, that we are in DEI seemingly discovering this as something new. It's actually not new at all, right? There is a long history and a painful history for many, and I can't recognize the rise of anti-Semitism as well. So, and especially sitting here in Germany, where anti-Semitism in the workplace isn't even discussed, nor Islamophobia, although it's an emerging topic, and it's a really important topic. And how do we have these kind of conversations in workplaces? And the lesson that I draw from working with a number of organizations is that organizations that have paid attention to this dimension of diversity early, when there wasn't a social crisis around it, tend to do better because they're more practiced and rehearsed. Now that we are experiencing a rise in bias and salience of this topic, all of a sudden, if we haven't practiced talking about religion, religious background, its meaning, including non-affiliated atheists, agnostics, and so forth, if we are not practiced in our teams, in our workplaces as leaders, we have a lot of catch up to do, and we need to do it fast.
Thanks, Joerg. So I do want to get to the past, but I do want to give Robbie and Isaac a chance to speak about the present and current trends if you would like to share.
Great. Well, maybe I'll bridge it a little bit. So I've been thinking about this question on the way here. Like, why is the work on religion and DEI so hard? And maybe more importantly, why is it getting harder in the U.S.? I think that's one of the things I've been really thinking about. And one of the ways of understanding that is like, well, what's going on? And I think my lane here is to talk about the bigger picture. What's going on, particularly in the U.S. context? And one way of thinking about this is that if we realize that we are at the sort of crest of what I would say is perhaps the most consequential transformation of the religious landscape in American history. We're experiencing that crest. So what do I mean by that? One thing to say is that in the last 30 years, we have really experienced a really reshuffling of the religious groups in the United States. And one thing, in order to see this, we have to sort of combine two lenses that we sometimes keep separate. We have to think about race and ethnicity and religious identity together. And in the U.S., that's always been an important way of thinking about identity in the U.S. So I'm kind of using that, and that's really the way sociologists and political scientists analyze religion in this country, is by combining racial, ethnic, and religious identities as we think about this. But I'll just give you a couple of trends in the last 30 years. So if we go back even as late as the kind of early 2000s, the United States was still, demographically speaking, a majority white, non-Hispanic Christian country. So in 2008, when our first African-American president was running for president, the country was 54% white and Christian. So if you take all Christians together, Catholic, Protestant, non-denominational, all that, 54% white and Christian. By the end of our first African-American president's tenure, that number had dropped to 47%. That number today is 42%. Right, so we've continued this kind of decline in kind of the kind of dominance, majority identity of the country from white Christian being a majority white Christian country to one that's no longer a majority white Christian country. On the other end of that spectrum, the other thing we've never seen in American history is the rise of religiously unaffiliated Americans. Right, that's the bookend to this. So again, we go back to the early 90s. Single digits of Americans claim no religious affiliation whatsoever. That number today is 27%, right? So it's tripled in the last 30 years. Among young people, it's 40%, right? Americans under the age of 30, it's 40% who claim no religious affiliation in the country. The other one to kind of point out is if you only look at Catholics, their numbers have actually remained quite steady at about 1 in 5 Americans. However, that hides an ethnic transformation of Catholics in this country from being almost entirely white with this kind of small sliver of non-white Catholics to today, like in the Southwest, on the West Coast, a majority of Catholics are non-white, right? That's new also to the American religious landscape. So we've experienced this great religious churn and transformation, and in particular, the one that I think makes it very difficult in terms of power. And this is kind of what we're seeing, particularly in some of the backlash of things like where's the Christian group, where's the evangelical group, right? Those kinds of things is about this transformation. I'm going to end with this one quote from a historian that I think tells you how this works together. If you were in charge of something big before 1960, chances are you grew up in a white Protestant milieu. Right? That was largely a way of who's in charge of the government, who's in charge of the courts, who's in charge of business, Fortune 100 CEOs, right? We even have a term for it, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant WASP, right? That kind of cultural term for that lock on power. And so part of what we're experiencing is this kind of shift from the center and from a kind of demographic dominance to white Christians being just one other group around the table. And that's a very difficult adjustment, I think, for many people in that white Christian group to make, is to realize, oh, we don't own the table, we're not inviting other people up as our guest, we're actually just one other person around a round table like these. And I think that's part of what we're experiencing in the country. But I think one of the reasons why, again, it's hard and getting harder is that shift in power that runs along the lines of race, ethnicity, and religious identity is part of what is kind of stirring the pot here. And I'll say this: our politics are not helping, right here. But over the next 6 months, it is going to get harder because this ethno-religious identity is going to be pushed we already know, by one leader of one of our two political parties as a sort of dividing line, right? We're going to be arguing less over policy and more over identity. And that's going to make the jobs of everybody else in this room really challenging over the next 6 months.
Great. Thank you so much.
Maybe I can shift to the past as well as kind of a bridge with an eye on time as well. I'm delighted to be here. A lot of my research is about the history of efforts to accommodate and include religion in work. And so I'm really delighted to be part of this conversation and thinking a little bit about the history that underlies some of what we're seeing today. As we've heard, in my work, I think I've seen two really important tensions existing today, most of which have already been referred to, that I can offer a little bit of historical perspective to. One is, I think, this tension between understanding religion as something disruptive to the workplace versus understanding religion as a resource to be mobilized to advance work in the workplace. And the second, which I think Robbie spoke to especially, is this tension between understanding efforts to be religiously inclusive as needing to address the particular needs of religious minorities within a context that is largely structured already to meet the needs of kind of dominant white Christian groups versus understanding white Christian groups as one group around the table with similar kinds of needs to be included as other religious groups as well. There's a very long history. I'm a historian of American religion. There's a very long history in the United States of religious discrimination against a whole wide variety of groups. And there's a long history of religious employers working to shape their businesses and their business cultures in line with their religious values. That's not something that's particularly new. What's newer is the idea that employers have an obligation to accommodate and be responsive to the religious needs of their employees. Newish. I'm a historian. If you think back to the 1940s, so it's not quite that new anymore, but the first real efforts to involve the state, to involve US law in requiring private employers to meet the needs of their religious employees really has its roots in the 1940s and the period of World War II, with an executive action by President Roosevelt that mandated that federal contractors working with the government had to pursue non-discrimination measures around categories of race, national origin, and religion. And there was a thought at that time that those efforts would quickly expand to federal legislation actually requiring those mandates. That was not to come for at least 2 more decades until the 1960s. But the 1940s and 50s, I think this is actually an important backdrop, there was a lot of work and effort at state-level governments to begin to address questions of equal employment opportunity in the workplace. Right here in New York, which the first statewide commission against discrimination was created in the 1940s, that had a mandate to address discrimination on the basis of race, national origin, and religion. Religion was a part of those efforts from the get-go. But by and large, on nobody's radar at the time was really questions of religious accommodation or inclusion. It was really non-discrimination measures, where by religion they had in mind groups like Jews in New York who were literally not being hired on account of being Jewish or being fired on account of being Jewish. And for them, the New York Commission at the time spent a lot of time focusing on the needs of minorities like Jews. Under national origin, they were concerned with the needs of Germans and of Irish and of Italians. Under race, especially African Americans, and didn't draw neat distinctions among those categories. They were really interested in making sure that private employers did not discriminate on hiring and firing bases. As early as the 1950s, groups like Jews and Seventh-day Adventists, who celebrate the Sabbath on Saturday, began actually writing to the New York State Commission, what do we do about Sabbath observance? Can we get Friday night, Saturdays off from work? And the New York State Commission Against Discrimination was very torn on that question. They kind of hedged it, and they ultimately said, look, it'd be really good if private employers did, but they don't have to. It's not actually discriminating if they cannot accommodate religious observances, if their schedules really dictate that people have to work on those days. So there was kind of a mindset that you couldn't hire or fire, but you didn't have to go much further than that necessarily to accommodate the needs of religious minorities. I'm going to move kind of quickly ahead because I know of time, but with the creation of the EEOC in 1964 and some of its work in the 1960s and 70s, the EEOC quickly became, while religion was largely not on their agenda, it was not central to the work that they did, through the 1970s, largely in response to advocacy efforts by Orthodox Jews, by Seventh-day Adventists and others, who were really concerned with how to make work schedules that were not built to fit the needs of religious minorities, be more responsive. The EOC actually took the lead in the late 60s and 70s in really trying to be responsive and drive corporations and companies to be more accommodating. Their efforts got stymied somewhat by a Supreme Court decision in 1977, a case of Hardison that was recently revisited by the Supreme Court last year that you may have been following or not in the news. And what's interesting, I think, important about this moment in the 70s is that the EEOC was really focused on a kind of a civil rights mandate to address the needs of minority communities who had distinct histories of discrimination, distinct histories of not having their needs met, and kind of in some ways doing the bare minimum to make workplaces that were on some level more responsive to the needs of these distinct minority groups. With kind of the backlash against affirmative action in the 1980s, the conversation shifts again, I think, in important ways. And in the 1980s, you see a shift from attention to particular legally protected categories to a broader attention to the category of diversity. That was a much more amorphous term that made space for all sorts of different kinds of differences. And religion at times fit into that category and at times didn't. And throughout the 1990s and 2000s, religion gradually comes to be included within these larger efforts to manage and accommodate diversity. But now it's less attention to the specific needs of distinct minority communities with histories of discrimination, persecution, marginalization, and more kind of a larger idea that everybody has religious or spiritual needs that ought to be accommodated, that ought to be included. And that, I think, came with both real gains in terms of workplaces starting to become more proactive. And what does it mean to actually build workplace cultures that are broadly inclusive rather than kind of reactionary or reacting to particular minority groups with particular needs. But at the same time, like, there's also certain losses or risks we can talk about too when everybody kind of gets leveled out into everybody in some ways has similar needs to be included or accommodated, rather than paying attention to particular groups who the schedules, the structures of the workplace were not really built to accommodate or respond to. I can offer much more detail. That's probably too much already. Maybe I'll pause there.
Zahra, I know your work also gets into the historical background of Islamophobia that we're seeing today. Did you want to cover that?
Sure, happy to. Thank you so much. So the past, how did we get here? Part of what Isaac is pointing out is that the underpinning of these legal changes over the years is religious freedom. And the idea of religious freedom, a concept that, among others, among the founding fathers, was something that Thomas Jefferson actually got from his copy of the Quran, the holy book of Muslims, because it is a central tenet of Islam, religious freedom. And you can see throughout history, especially in the major Muslim empires that existed from, say, roughly the 700s to the 1500s, despite political differences across empires, you saw the upholding of religious freedom. People of different faiths being able to practice freely. You also saw not just that respect, but you also saw the development of mutually inspiring relationships and also interfaith cooperation. And that cooperation drove both inclusion and innovation. So for example, if you look at the Umayyads of Spain, what you find is that they developed great advancements in pharmacology, in medicine, in other kinds of sciences. And these kinds of advances were used up until World War I. They had free schools, libraries, running water, streets that were paved and lit. These were the kinds of amenities that the rest of Europe did not see for the next 700 years. And what happened is that when the Catholic monarchs came back to take this land back for themselves, what they did, rather than embrace this civilization and try to build on the knowledge society that they had created, not just Muslims, but Muslims working with Jews and with Christians and everybody else, they destroyed it. They destroyed it. They expelled more than 300,000 Muslims and just as many Jews. And they burned more than 1 million Arabic books. They also rewrote history to frame Muslims as these dark-skinned, diabolical, violent savages. This was inspired by Crusader history and this propaganda, this anti-Muslim propaganda that then morphs into Orientalism and the ascendancy of the Western superiority over the East, specifically the Islamic world, and that then gets integrated into law and policy, arts and culture, literature, etc. It informs US pop culture, eventually social media, and then in more recent years, we get to these stereotypes being amplified and globalized via social media through an industry called the Islamophobia industry. So let's take a look at what that has been like since 2008.
A multi-million-dollar industry is using American news networks to push the message that Islam itself is a threat.
The Islamophobia industry is a tight-knit group of individuals and organizations that, for lots of money, whip up fervor among the general public about the fear of Islam.
Across America, the number of organizations that are promoting an anti-Muslim sentiment has tripled in the last 3 years, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center.
What we're really talking about are conspiracy theories about Muslims. So, for example, all Muslims are terrorists, Muslims are incapable of fitting in Western societies.
So you can see how these then go on to impact the workplace and how people might think about their Muslim colleagues and clients. And I'll end here that, again, this is not something that is particular to the US, but globally, most countries express hostility against various religious groups, both their governments and their societies, despite international and national laws guaranteeing religious freedom and protecting folks from discrimination. And since 2007, Muslims have been the #2 target globally. #1 is Christians.
Thank you. I want to move now, lastly, to the future. And I want to start with Joerg, who offers an excellent global perspective. So if current and historical trends continue, what might we expect to see in the future? I think you're on mute.
Yeah. What a big question, right? I mean, and it's always dangerous to answer questions about the future. So the first answer needs to be, we really don't know. However, there are maybe a few things to take in and to recognize. You know, one is, I think we're seeing, you know, I mean, we already mentioned it in many ways, the resurgence of religiously based identity. And that gets conflated with ideas of nationality and ethnicity and all these kind of things. But there are strong, powerful movements everywhere in the world to restore this kind of ethno-religious identity, purity, and hegemony. And that's where history then serves as a reference point for all these groups, right? And in probably the worst way. And you know, that's where politics, religion, and power have always been intermingled and intertwined. And that's the dangerous historical legacy that we can actually look at and need to understand and look at. That's where education is needed, now more than ever. And I think to the important point that there is this big structural movement going on, at the same time, there is an individual need, almost a craving for a certain sense of religious identification, I would call it. And I think this is not necessarily part of that overall movement. I think there is we are all making sense of our lives in the midst of a polycrisis. You know, Fatima talked about the world being upside down and sideways, and that's maybe how it really feels. And at the same time, we're all needing to make sense out of multiple crises at the same time, and that taxes our individual, whether it's nervous systems, whether it is our communities, our own families, and we're looking for answers, we're looking for support somewhere. And it's not a surprise that religion has been and has played this important psychosocial function for all of us to give us a path through uncertainty. You know, that's one of the the kind of individual psychological functions of religion. So now we are sitting there with these two opposing trends potentially, the individual needs that are satisfied by religion to some degree. By the way, they may also compete a little bit with what organizations can offer. You know, when you think about, there have been some studies done on belonging and so forth, that the source of belonging for many people is their family and then their workplace. Right? When you think about that for a little bit, and maybe religion is now a third wheel to this, but now we're competing a little bit for belonging in a sense. And how do we do that while we are subject to these bigger structural trends of power dynamics around religious identity and identification? So I think why I'm saying this, the future will require that we become comfortable with offering spaces for exploration, for learning, and for collective sense-making that hopefully, if we do it well, can inoculate us from the worst parts of polarization that is also possibly in our future.
Thank you. Robbie, I know your work at PRRI, these surveys can help make predictions. So what do you think when you think about how current historical trends might lead?
Yeah, I'm going to claim the same disclaimer. Our surveys are like snapshots of where we are in time. I'm always nervous about like projecting them forward because it's really challenging. I will say this, I'm going to go back to this point. So I wrote a book in the last fall called The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future. And in that book, I was looking for like, okay, so yeah, why is this so hard? What is the root of all of this? And the root of all this actually is this claim. And I think we've always, in the American context, had these two mutually contradictory claims that we, in this generation, I think are wrestling with because they have just continued to be kicked down the road, and because the demographic changes have shifted in such a way that this question that has often been hidden is now on the surface. And the question is, are we a divinely God-ordained promised land for European Christians? Like, is that who the country is? Is that who this land is of, by, and for? Or are we a pluralistic democracy where, again, everyone has an equal seat around the table? And I think that question is one that's going to be front and center for us. It's running through our politics, it's running through our culture, it's running through our corporations, and it's a challenge, right? And here's what I'm hopeful about, though. We had the privilege of partnering actually with Tanenbaum back in 2013 and doing that big national survey. And one of the things that we found is that, first of all, there aren't many institutions in the country that hold people together across lines of difference. There just aren't. Churches sure as hell don't do it. Right? Martin Luther King's 11 a.m. on Sunday mornings, the most segregated hour in the country, is still largely true. There are not many neighborhood associations that do it. Schools have become resegregated over time. It's corporations. In that survey, when people said, where do we encounter people who look different, who believe different, it's actually the corporate world. That is more Americans than not say that's where we encounter this kind of difference. So if I'm thinking about the future, that's the hope, I think, is that the companies, the groups like this that are taking this seriously, it's not only good for business, right? It, in fact, is good for democracy. So,
that's great.
I agree. I'll build on that just very briefly, which is to say that I think, religious freedom, as Zahra alluded to, is a really complicated concept. But on the one hand, can be used really to build a culture of inclusion and difference, where people can appeal to the idea of religious freedom, to think about what do we owe each other, what are our responsibilities to each other, and how do we build a culture in which everyone can be included and everyone can belong. And religious freedom can also operate, can be used by people to opt out of participating in public society, a way of saying, no, I don't have to do that because it's my religion, let's say, for example. So I think one of the tensions we see right now, and I imagine this going forward, is on the one hand, using religious freedom as a way to build workplace cultures in the society more broadly, that is broadly inclusive and responsive to everyone's needs, versus the ways that we're also seeing religious freedom being used to opt out of participating in DEI initiatives and programs, and the ways that people are trying to say, I don't need to be a part of these programs, I don't have broader responsibilities to others. And it's actually somewhere where I find, again, the historian in me finds actually looking at the history of the EEOC's efforts around these questions really, really useful and productive. Because what the EEOC guidelines say very, very clearly is that asserting a religious claim in the workplace is not the end of the conversation, but it's the beginning of a conversation. That is, we talk a lot in this country about rights as something that is absolute, that I have a right to. And we need to, I think, do better at talking about our responsibilities, our values, our collective commitments, and obligations to others. And what the EEOC says is that when somebody asserts a religious claim, the employer has an obligation to do what they can to find a creative, flexible solution to accommodate them, to take into account the needs of coworkers, the needs of the business, and the needs of the employees. And to the point about democratic society, it's actually a really, I think, lovely model for thinking about the way that religion should be the start of a conversation about what are our values, where can we be flexible, where can we be creative, where can't we, and how do we build a society where we can actually talk across these differences and find solutions that are mutually beneficial for everyone.
Wonderful. Zahra, would you like to have the last word?
Sure, that's a tall order, but happy to say a few things about where we're going as the future looms. Of course, I don't have a crystal ball either, but, oh, this is not advancing. There we go, okay. But I think it's important to think a little bit broader and longer. So if we think about the mega trends that are shaping the world through 2050, 2060, artificial intelligence, climate change, conflicts, crises like COVID, et cetera, it's entirely possible that they could drive religious violence. And let me explain why. Because historically, and I mean like millennia of history, not just the last 50 or 100 years, climate shocks, conflicts, the rise in uncertainty, the scarcity of resources, it has driven religious scapegoating and violence. And so that is the sad and scary possibility going forward. We also know that demographically, although in Western countries you see the rise and the growth of the unaffiliated populations, in the rest of the world that is not the case. It's going in the opposite direction. In fact, religious groups are growing. In 2010, 84% of the world affirmed a religious identity. By 2050, it's projected to be 87%, perhaps even higher. The greatest growth is going to be among Muslims. They will have near parity with the Christian population in the world, about 30% of the world population. Today, they are 25%. And in the context where they live, largely in Africa and Asia, where you also will see major growth in Christian populations, those are also the spaces where climate change and conflict are projected to rise rapidly. So I think that we have some challenging potential situations going forward, especially for multinational corporations and for those of you invested in ESG abroad and so forth. These are really important issues for us to think about and work on now so that we can mitigate some of the risks that may be involved. Because as issues emerge, you will see growing numbers of climate and conflict migrants and refugees that will go to other countries, largely in the West, seeking support, and we've seen how that's gone in the last number of years in changing and altering the composition of those countries and those cities. And so I think that we need to be very careful. You can see in the image here this really egregious sign in Poland that was put up in the last few years as well. There is hope. There is hope, especially because part of those demographic changes show us that Gen Z is the most religiously diverse population ever, and also the most racially diverse. They, even those who are unaffiliated, want to see religion included in the workplace through DEI initiatives. And also, globally, Gen Z are committed to the protection of religious minorities. And that's based on a survey of 21,000 folks from 21 countries all over the world. What can we do with this? Well, we can try to use the data to drive strategies for religious inclusion through, right now, employee engagement. How do we foster respect in the workplace? Well, you do it by fostering religious literacy and addressing issues of religious bias and prejudice. And that's exactly what Tanenbaum does, really beautifully, really well. You can foster mutually inspiring relationships among folks who are of religiously diverse backgrounds, including the non-religious, by starting or supporting interfaith ERGs or faith-based ERGs for community support, socializing, and service, and those are the particular things that we know move the needle on actually religious understanding and interfaith cooperation. Religious Freedom and Business Foundation does this kind of work very well, so does Tanenbaum, and so does Interfaith America. And then lastly, you want to try and foster interfaith cooperation, invest in that space based on shared values, and that's something that Interfaith America does very well also. So I think there's a lot of work ahead of us, but there are ways to do this work well together, and I hope to do that with you if that's of interest. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Let's give our panelists a round of applause. Okay, and I believe that we're at time, so we'll move on out and let the next panel go. But thank you so much for listening. Thanks to our panelists.